We begin with the United States and jubilant scenes on Capitol Hill from Republican lawmakers as they pass President Trump's landmark spending bill. It was dubbed the Big Beautiful Bill, the massive tax and expenditure document, which is nearly 1,000 pages long, includes things like increased spending on border security and the US military. It also extends a raft of tax cuts President Trump put in place during his first term. Well, to help pay for all this, the bill includes cuts to healthcare benefits and Medicaid, and also slashing food assistance programs. It passed through Congress by just 4 votes after marathon deliberations and a show of resistance, as expected, from the Democrats, one making a record 8-hour speech in order to delay its passage. So how can we expect the bill to impact the economy? Well, here's Erin Delmore.
This bill contains one unambiguous piece of good news for the markets. That's because it has a provision that increases America's infamous debt ceiling, the law which places a limit on how much money the government can borrow. It had been the case that the Treasury was due to crash through the debt ceiling in August or September. Now that's been pushed back by a couple of years. And any threat of an imminent default, however unlikely, has gone away. But it's estimated that it will cause America's long-term debt to grow by $3.4 trillion over the next decade. That is bad news for the U.S. bond market. Yields rose on Thursday after the bill's passage, and when yields rise, prices drop. U.S. Treasuries have seen demand decline as fiscal concerns rise. Tax revenue in the U.S. is estimated to fall by $4.5 trillion over the next decade, while corporate earnings and stocks are projected to boom. Stocks rose on Thursday, and the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq hit new record highs, buoyed also by strong new jobs data.
That was Erin Delmore there. Well, for more on this, I spoke to Bradley Saunders he's a North America economist at Capital Economics, and I began by asking for his take on the bill.
I suppose the main way to think about this bill is that it's largely a continuation of the measures which Trump put in place during his first term, so it extends his tax cuts out into the future. There are also additional tax cuts coming in, and as I say, additional spending on the military and on border security coming at the cost of Medicaid and nutritional assistance. I suppose, given that this is largely offset by the tariff revenue, which will come in over the next few years as well, it doesn't really look to be moving the budget deficit up nor down. So it shouldn't really be seen as a stimulus to the economy, but rather preventing a tightening which would have come had Donald Trump's tax cuts not been extended.
OK, so hold on. That's the point I wanted to pick up on next. What is America actually getting out of this bill? What will Donald Trump have achieved?
I suppose it's about increasing spending in areas which Republicans care about most. So that's the military.
Does the country need spending in those areas when you look at the spreadsheets?
Again, it's going back to, it's about what Republicans matter. It's what Trump was elected on. He elected on the idea of lower taxes on higher spending in areas which Republicans traditionally care about, like defense, like border security, and therefore coming at the cost of areas which Democrats tend to care about. So nutritional assistance, Medicare, clean energy production credits, which came in under President Biden. So it's more just a reallocation of spending as opposed to a stimulus.
OK, but ultimately, it's going to be how this is felt by the American people. Is there going to be any trickle-down economics taking place here?
The tax cuts, I suppose, are trying to do that. There are tax cuts mostly for middle-income families. That was the target, but also for people working overtime, people on lower pay, for pensioners. So in that sense, it will be able to meet those at the lower income tax bracket as well.
And what sort of areas would economists like yourself be watching very, very closely in terms of impacts on the US economy?
I think the most important point is what this will mean for the bond market and therefore the US's cost of borrowing. The budget deficit's already at about 6% of GDP, which is pretty high by historical standards. Federal debt's nearing 100% of GDP as well. For the moment, the market seems to have not reacted too much to this news, given it was largely as expected, this extension of the tax cuts. But what matters is how investors will perceive it going forward, if this is a case that, although the debt ceiling has been pushed out, whether this is seen to add to debt, which is currently on as unsustainable as it is,
And that was Bradley Saunders speaking to me earlier. Well, staying in the US and the latest on those tariffs, because President Trump has said that he expects to be sending out letters to notify countries of the level of tariffs that they are set to face next week. A 90-day pause on so-called reciprocal tariffs runs out on Wednesday. That is, except those who have struck a trade deal, which so far only includes the UK and Vietnam, with many others scrambling to make their own arrangements. But time is running out. Here's President Trump speaking earlier.
So we have a couple of other deals, but my inclination is to send a letter out and saying what tariff they're going to be paying. It's just much easier. We have, far more than 170 countries. And how many deals can you make? And you can make good deals, but they're very much more complicated. I'd rather, and I've been like this from the beginning, I'd rather send out a letter saying this is what you're going to pay.
So just how are those trade talks going? I put that question to Andrew Hale from the think tank, the Heritage Foundation in Washington.
Well, it's not looking good for Japan because, of course, the United States wants access to the Japanese agriculture market, and that's very protected. Also, the United States, and President Trump in particular, wants Japan to purchase U.S. automobiles. But I just have to say there's really not much of a demand for U.S. automobiles. The Japanese don't want to purchase the large SUVs, et cetera. They prefer to have smaller cars, et cetera. Countries that we've been announced, there's a rare earths critical minerals deal with China, but again, we've not seen the framework document. Basically, I think what they're doing here is they're not announcing a pause, which I expect will be coming at some point, because they want to keep the pressure on. By announcing these letters that are going out, they're putting the pressure on for countries to scramble forward to provide some concessions to get tariffs reduced. But I've been hearing from senior figures in the administration that there's likely to be a pause until September. Whether or not, for example, Liberation Day tariffs come back into force on the 9th of July for a few days, I think the markets will be a moderating force. I'll finish with this. How did we get here in the first place? We got the 3-month pause because the U.S. bond market was about to crash 3 months ago, and Donald Trump nearly had his own Liz Truss moment. So I think the markets will be a moderating force on producing another pause to facilitate further negotiations.
Andrew, how economically transparent? I don't know if that makes sense, but the whole process, the transparency, there were so many questions, weren't there, when Liberation Day was announced. And a couple of hours later, people started working through the figures and said they just didn't add up.
They didn't add up because they're not reciprocal tariffs. They're basically addressing trade deficits. And we've been running trade deficits for decades with countries. And we do that because the whole world wants to invest in our financial assets. We have an investment surplus here in the United States. We also have Americans with proportionally larger disposable incomes to purchase goods from around the world. And God help us if we lose those two things. So I'm not really as concerned about trade deficits because that's a flip side of a demand for our assets. But I understand that there are those in the administration who are concerned about trade deficits. And that was what it was. These Liberation Day tariffs were an attempt to address some of that.